Hi, welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina, and my guest today is Tanis Gray. Hi, Tanis.
Hi, how are you?
I'm so happy to finally meet you. So I've been following you on Instagram for quite a while, and honestly, I'm just blown away by your productivity. So I went on your Ravelry, and there is north of 600 designs there.
There's a lot. Yeah.
I mean, did you start when you were three? Like, when did you publish your first design?
Um, yeah, I started when I was 8, actually. So not too far off, but I was born with a sleep disorder and I'd just be up all the time. So my mother was looking for a way to kind of keep me occupied, and not wake up the rest of the house, mainly my brother. So she was getting back into knitting after a very long amount of time away from it. And she had had a hard time kind of finding a community to embrace her. They didn't have, beautiful yarn shops like they do now or an online community. And she would go into a yarn shop and she said it was very much like, we have this knowledge and we're not willing to share it with you. So she was kind of getting back into it with the help of a neighbor and making me this like fuzzy purple mauve sweater extravaganza. And I wanted to learn how to knit as well. So she figured that would be a great way to keep me occupied while everyone else was sleeping. So, I started off with some, I think it was like maroon acrylic and bright blue needles. And my dad taught me how to turn on the TV, and I would just kind of tiptoe downstairs and I knit until the yarn ran out. I made, a garter scarf, which a lot of people start with, and I would watch Babar on TV in the morning and, kind of wait for the house to wake up. So I have been knitting for a long time, and it's always been kind of this comfort thing to me that having a sleep disorder is weird because the rest of the world is sleeping, but I've kind of chosen my whole life to look at it as a gift rather than this curse of not being able to sleep well. And that is how I've been so productive. I get more hours than most people by not sleeping.
Well, do you feel like it's your almost like security blanket? Like you can always have that and like it's childhood memories and it's comforting memories?
I'm sure that's part of it. Yeah, it is, being safe at home, and it's still dark outside, and all the people that are a really important part of your life are asleep and you have this thing. But I think it's also this need that I've always had to be productive. I'm not that person that just watches Netflix. I have to be knitting and watching Netflix, or knitting and listening to an audiobook, or I I really like to multitask. And your creative part of your brain is different than your other part of your brain. So I like to keep them both occupied. And I'm not an idle person. So I always bring my knitting and have other crafts that I enjoy too. So
Yes,
yes.
so I mean, from what I've read, you do quilting, you do
Yeah.
needlework, right?
Yep. I got into
What other
wood.
fiber crafts?
Yeah. So I mean, it, I feel like knitting is sort of a gateway drug. You can I enjoy it. It's also become my job. So I need something else as a different creative outlet. And I really enjoyed quilting. I like knitting because it's a useful act, right? You're cold, so you make a sweater. I have a friend who builds ships and bottles, and he always makes fun of me for knitting. It's like, well, it's cool what you're doing, but when you're done with it, you put it up on a shelf. There's nothing like making a gift for someone else and, oh, great, fingerless mitts, my office is freezing, I can use these. And quilts, I find, are just they're like puzzles, which I love puzzles, and they're a great gift. People always want to snuggle with a blanket, and in good times and bad, making a quilt for someone and saying, here, I hope this brings you some comfort. There's no stronger magic, I think, than crafting and gifting.
Right. Well, when you were younger, like going back, like I was talking to Mindful Knitting, she's on Instagram, and she mentioned that like she teaches at school and she teaches kids to knit at school just to keep them calm, like it's part of meditation basically. And she mentioned that like whenever she would ask a child like what do you want to knit, they would say, "Oh, I want to make scarf for mom or hat for dad or something for somebody. Like when you were younger, was it also like part of your mentality to make something for others, or did you do it
Always.
for yourself?
Yep, always. And for me, it was mittens. So the woman that was helping my mom kind of get back into knitting because she couldn't go online. There was no YouTube and she couldn't find a community to embrace her. This same woman also embraced me, and my brother and her son happened to be best friends. And she got me this book on mittens, and I just took it and ran with it. So everyone got mittens, the postal lady, the lady who came to clean up our house, the neighbor, everybody got mittens, whether they wanted them or not. And I eventually ran out of people to make mittens for. But even now, I don't knit for myself very often. I really want to make things for other people. That is how I show my love for other people. Some people bake, and I like to bake, but you know, you eat the loaf of bread and it's done. So I love that it's a gift that can go on for a very long time.
Okay, so you started with that garter scarf, and then what happened between that and your first design? Like when did you first felt like you were a designer?
It, well, I guess there's two answers to that. One was the mitten extravaganza. So not being able to find what I wanted. And we didn't have a local yarn shop growing up. We had Walmart, and Lion Brand was what I learned on, and I loved it. And it was readily available. And that was my option. That was it. And I grew up in Boston, and we would go up to New Hampshire a lot. And there was a little yarn shop there called the Yarn Barn. And this lady who was incredible, and she talked to me like an adult, and she sat me at her little table, and she had this little dog who would sit on my feet, and she said, "You are going to make mittens today." Okay, I guess I'm making mittens. And she gave me DPNs and two colors, and I had never done that. And I didn't approach it as something to be scary. I teach a lot, and I love teaching. And a lot of people are like, "Oh, I don't know about this, two colors," or, "Oh my God, a sweater, there's shaping." And it didn't strike me as something to be afraid of. And she was just so kind about, this is what you're doing. And then I started making the mittens that I wanted to. And so that's when I first started kind of designing what I wanted. But I would say until I was at Vogue Knitting, and we had kind of a sweater emergency, and my boss called me and said, "You're making this sweater." I never really saw myself as, a publishable, if that's a word, designer.
So, how did we get to Vogue knitting? Like, what was the? I mean, I know I'm going a lot back, but I just feel like this is how, like, a lot of people who are thinking about how to start it are super interested in the beginnings of others.
Right, mine is a very weird, crooked path for sure. I didn't ever intend to make this a career. I went to RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, and I majored in animation. And I did my thesis in animation, and I wanted to work for Pixar, and that was my dream job. It still kind of is. And I didn't want to move to California. So I graduated RISD. I got a job working for Martha Stewart, and I would make the crafts for her kids magazine. And that was a lot of fun because you're getting paid to craft.
Right.
And that was a freelance gig. So I would work in film and TV when I wasn't freelancing at Martha Stewart. And then, when you're young and in New York and you have to pay rent, I would also work at Pier 1 at night, selling furniture and stuff. And that Martha Stewart gig ended because she went to jail. And when you freelance, you can't sit around and wait. So I was kind of hustling and taking more and more film and TV work, always in the art department, kind of making things. And the hours are brutal on a film set. You might be there at 5 a.m. and get home at midnight. And that's just how it is. And it is, at the time anyway, when I was in the industry, it's a very male dominated industry, and that can get tiresome in certain respects. And I was looking for another job, and I happened to find this job opening at Vogue Knitting. And I thought, I've been knitting forever, and all throughout college, and even when I worked in film and TV, I always had my knitting with me, always. And I applied, and I got hired on the spot. And left those industries and focused more on knitting. But I still didn't think it would be a career. I thought, okay, I'm getting into publishing, and I still get to create, and that's great. But I wasn't hired as a designer. I was hired as the yarn editor. So I still never really pictured myself as designing something in a magazine or a book. It didn't occur to me that I could do that too.
Right. I mean, I love that story just because, we talked about before the interview that like sometimes like I have no idea where this channel is going, and you said, well, I didn't know where my career that it's going to become my career either, and I sort of like that open end, like that you going through life and you don't necessarily have it all planned out and just surprises you.
For sure. I don't know anyone. I mean, and even if you think you have it planned out, it's certainly not going to happen the exact way you think it will. And that's what keeps life interesting. But it can be scary too, leaving animation and film and something I always loved and really enjoyed doing. And I was animating for HBO and doing all this cool stuff and just thinking, I don't know if I want to do this forever. And kind of randomly finding this Vogue knitting job, it was a complete turn in a different direction. And I'm where I'm supposed to be now.
Right.
So
Well, so at this moment you have north of 13 books, the last
yep.
thing.
And I'm just starting two more
Right.
because,
So
why not?
let's talk about the first one. Like, how did the idea of writing a book became a thing?
Well, again, it wasn't. It back then it was, the big knitting companies like Interweave and Vogue Knitting, they were kind of producing the knitting books. Self-publishing wasn't really a thing. Ravelry was kind of just starting. And doing your own book or even a book as kind of a no-name designer and putting it out there wasn't even on my radar. And I left Vogue Knitting because we moved from New York City to Washington D.C. And I thought, that's it. Now I'm going to have to figure out what I'm doing now. And when I left, I my boss said, you should do a book. And I was in DC, and New York isn't that far. It's an easy train ride. And I thought, okay, I can do this. And I wanted to do something about sustainable yarn. My husband is a mechanical engineer, and he focuses on sustainability and green things. And they do a lot of museums and schools and bringing them up to code and making them more just energy efficient and better for not only people but the environment as well. So I thought, that's important with knitting too. We're creating all this fiber, but how exactly, you buy it and you're like, oh, this is great, I love it, I can't wait to knit with it. Where did that come from? It's like ingredients in cooking. Where, the farmer's market, I love that, the farm that your artichoke came from or whatever. So that I was really interested in kind of the path of from sheep to skein. So I pitched this book idea, and my Vogue Knitting Soho Publishing loved it, and it was kind of the first book to talk about where your yarn comes from, and it was all focused on American yarns. So a lot of people import their base, their blank yarn, and dye it and sell it, but a lot of those bases come from like China or Turkey. I wanted to focus on yarn that was grown here. So whether it was grown on a plant on a North American soil, or an animal that lived in a pasture somewhere in Wyoming, and kind of follow it all the way through. And that was really interesting. I love research. I always have. And that wasn't really a big thing in the early, 2010-ish, that people weren't super focused on that. So it was hard to find enough companies that were completely in the United States and follow that journey. And it did great. It won a bunch of awards, and it was a lot of fun. And I thought, okay, I did that. What's next? So
Well, I
um,
mean, like, so when you did the book, was anything in that process like surprising for you in a negative or positive sort of way?
I was well prepared to do it because of my training at Vogue Knitting. So, as the yarn editor, I was kind of the link between the outside world and the magazine. So I would do the call for submissions, and we would get, thousands of designs, whether for a specific story or sometimes it wasn't a specific story. It was just like, hey, submit a design, and kind of deciding with my boss what would work well for the magazine, picking the yarn, kind of hand holding the designer while they knit their thing, getting the item in, making sure it was properly done, where all the ends woven in. A whole lot of sweaters would come in, covered in dog hair and things like that. So getting things ready, photo ready, and making sure they were tagged properly, because the photographers are not necessarily knitters.
Right.
And especially with something like lace, you don't always know what's the right side and the wrong side if you're not into knitting. So, kind of going through that production, we would do, I think, about 36 magazines a year, and maybe 20 books or so. That part was easy for me, which is where a lot of people struggle, just because I'd had so much experience. But it is hard when you're working with a publisher. You don't get a say in everything. I didn't get to decide what the cover was. I'm very happy with the cover of that book, but not having a say in how it was photographed, or being able to be on set, or things like that, that can be hard as a type A person, especially not being able to have complete control.
You also self-published some books after that. What was the difference for you? Like, which one do you enjoy more? Like, was it harder or easier for you?
I'd say it was harder. I've only self-published one book, and it was almost like a giant therapy session for me. I had just had my first child. My son was born 2 months early in Washington, D.C., and he spent a month in the NICU. And I wasn't prepared. I mean, no one is prepared for that kind of sort of traumatic entry to the world. And having no idea, and really, we had just moved to DC. I didn't know a lot of people, just feeling very isolated and scared and alone. And we weren't sure he was going to survive, and just kind of living on this knife's edge every day of, like, what happens if this child doesn't make it, and if he does, what are the repercussions of him being born so early? And there wasn't a lot of focus on postpartum, and I wasn't really, I don't know if I wasn't able to ask for help, or help wasn't really offered. I felt kind of like I was just emotionally drowning, and I didn't want to knit. And when he finally came home and he was kind of plugged into all these machines, we called him the eye baby, because we would have to plug him into this heart and lung machine. I thought, okay, he was born in Washington, D.C., and I always thought that was kind of cool. There aren't a lot of Washington, D.C. natives, and it's not really a state. So it's like this land that doesn't belong anywhere. And I wanted to kind of make this book for him. So we would walk every day around the Capitol. We lived right next to the Capitol building. And every day we'd walk the dog, push him in the stroller, and be carrying this big machine on a backpack, to keep his heart and lungs working. And just looking at all the monuments and things, I thought it'd be kind of cool to do, an ode to Washington, D.C. And so we did that. I would do all my photos with him walking around, and at night I would knit. And I had a friend that I met through knitting who modeled for me, and we would go to certain locations and photograph, and it was really an interesting experience. And there was no deadline, so that pressure was nice. Or that pressure, not having that pressure, was nice. Of you, when you do a book, you have very specific deadlines you have to meet. And I didn't know if I ever would even publish it. It was just kind of, while keeping him alive, I needed to keep myself alive, and that project really helped me through. So, and that won some awards too, which was really nice. And that was my last experience self-publishing a book, but I still self-publish patterns all the time too.
How do you decide what patterns you're gonna self-publish and what patterns are gonna go into the book?
Yeah, that's tricky. Because the books I don't do a lot of solo books. I really like doing compilation books, and that's what I've been doing lately. Is I'll have a handful of designs in a book, but so much of my time is spent researching and getting yarn and writing. The writing takes, and the research just takes a really long time. My husband calls me the conductor, because you're behind the scenes doing all this stuff for all these people. And sometimes I just need to be working on a project that is not attached to any specific thing. So if I get an idea for, like my son had never seen the Goonies, and was like, "You're 10 years old, you've never seen the Goonies?" So, during the pandemic, we were watching a lot of movies that he had never seen, because we just didn't have time. And, after that, I thought I should really do a Goonies cowl. And that has nothing to do with books or anything. It was just something fun. So I would design it and knit it and self-publish that. So but sometimes, a designer or a magazine or a book wants a specific theme or a project, or you have to use this yarn, and you kind of run with that. So it's really kind of specific of what is the end goal for this project. Is it for someone else, or is it just for fun for me, or something that's been in my brain that I want to get out into the world, or is it for an upcoming book? Or I usually know that before I start, or it's just something that I want to try out. And not everything gets published. Not everything has to be a thing.
Right.
Sometimes it's an experiment and it didn't work, so you move on.
Well, I saw one interview with you where you said that when you did the proposal for the first book, you basically made the list of like bunch of proposals were all on the same book, and that was the book that was picked. Is that how your brain works in general? Like, do you have like 7,000 ideas in your head and you just like, okay, pick one?
It kind of it's there's always a lot happening. And I think a lot of it again comes back to that sleep disorder. My issue is a brainwave issue. So my brainwaves move 3 times more than the average person. So I can't ever get to that settled REM state. I can't shut off my brainwaves. It certainly doesn't mean I'm 3 times smarter, because that would be amazing. It just means that I've got kind of 3 trains of thought going at all times. So there's I what I'm lacking is time. There's just never seems to be enough time to get everything done. But yeah, I if you were here, I have post-its everywhere of, ideas or names that I came across in a book or something that would be a great pattern name, or there's a lot of ideas going on.
So how do you keep it? Like, is it all posted, or like do you have some system in place, like organizing those thoughts?
Yeah, I have spreadsheets. I'm a big, I'm very type A. I like my lists, and I am not above putting things on a list that I've already done just so I can cross it off. But I have a lot of lists of, dream projects, and like the publisher I'm working with now, because the 4 books we've done together have been so successful, they've kind of said to me, what do you want to do? These were the 4 that I wanted to do, or we decided to do. What would be kind of your dream project? And some of them can't happen, whether it's licensing rights or it's too old of a fandom or something like that. But I just pitched 2, and we're starting them, so I'm pretty excited. I like to have a lot of things going at once.
Right. Well, does that ever like stress you to have all those deadlines and all that expectation of like amount of work you have to perform?
It can, with especially during pandemic life. I've got 2 little kids, and we were doing homeschool for a year and a half. And even my youngest, she's only in preschool, so that's like 3 hours a day. And I've always been good with time management, but I feel like I've really become, that's like my superpower is good time management. And I like deadlines because when they're going to happen. Even if it's tight, then you make concessions. You might pull an all-nighter, or I'm unwilling to give up time with my kids. So if it means that we go to the park for 3 hours and I have to stay up and not try to sleep at all, then to me in the end game, that's worth it, because we got those 3 hours at the park or whatever. So I think deciding where my priorities are, and figuring out that time management, that's been key to keeping everyone happy. Especially now, times are so strange, and we've all had to adjust. And you might be homeschooling, and I might be writing a manuscript, and she might be coloring on my other side, and that's just how we've learned to make it work.
Right. Well, let's talk about designs themselves. So, like, as a designer, there is this balance of like what would sell, what looks cute and easy, but like, have the sellable quality to it, or some like technique that's impossible, but this is tickling your fancy at the moment and this is what you want to do. Like, how do you balance all of that? How do you decide what to put into the book, what would get the mass appeal, or what you want to do?
Books are definitely trickier than independent designs, because with books, I never want anyone excluded. And I think that, a lot of people are bullied as a kid, and I certainly was. And I know that feeling of being excluded. And especially as much as I love teaching knitting, I teach all the time. And I feel like that's part of my responsibility as a crafter to learn this stuff and then kind of turn around and teach it to somebody else. That's how, Elizabeth Zimmerman said, knitting is as old as sheep. That's one of my favorite quotes. There's a reason knitting has been around forever, because we're all links in a chain. I see it as my duty to pass it on to other people. I think of my mom, going into that knitting shop and being like, somebody help me. And then being like, no, why should we help you? And I, so when I write a book, I really am careful to make sure, okay, we've got some beginner stuff. We've got some really complicated stuff. And then we've got stuff in between that are like stepping stones. And I tend to submit my designs. So if I'm doing a book and we know, it's going to have 28 designs, I tend to do the call for submissions and kind of curate first. And, this goes through many rounds of, I pick what I think would work. And then my editor might say, yes, but let's take that out and put that in. And then, if it's a book with Disney or somebody, they might say, no, this can't be in here, or this doesn't represent our brand, or, this is missing. And then I kind of decide what I will submit. And a lot of times it's those easier projects, which is kind of goes against my nature of, pretty hardcore stranded color work. But it's really important. And, I teach a lot. I teach at my son's Boy Scout troop, and I'm trying to get the elementary school to do an after school knitting program. And I teach at women's shelters. And I really like those experiences because they're very different groups of people. And at the women's shelter, a lot of those women, we don't have a language that we share in common. And with knitting, you don't need that.
Right.
It's, here, let me hold your hands and I'll show you. And then that's a sense of empowerment. So me thinking of all these experiences, okay, we need really basic stuff. And we also need stuff that appeals to people like me, the hardcore. I really need to concentrate. This is going to be absolutely stunning projects. So that's a huge consideration. It's not all stranded color work and it's not all advanced projects. And that's important. I don't want anyone excluded. And I love the emails that are like, I can't knit, but I bought that book so I could learn how. And I started with, the knit pearl washcloths, and now I'm knitting my first sweater. There's nothing better. I love those emails.
So let's talk about Disney for a second. Was it difficult for you to pick favorites I mean, because there is so many, like,
Definitely. And they had parameters too. They didn't want anything with Frozen in it because they see that as its own separate franchise. And there are some Disney movies that are not my favorites. So, I had parameters too. And I also think it's really important to embrace more of the recent movies where, Disney is starting to show some diversity. My husband is Taiwanese, so my kids are half Asian. I love Mulan because my daughter will watch it and say, she looks like me. I
like
mean, and some kids look at Tiana, and like in Kanto, we've been watching, it's gotten to a point where we have to stop because we listen to that soundtrack so often. And it's great to have anybody be able to watch a Disney movie and say, they look like me. I think that's great. So picking the list of the movies, that was a lot of fun, because going back and forth with my editor, I might say, that movie wasn't my favorite. And she might say, well, they really want this movie. And, it's a lot of steps to make a book, but that is one of the first steps, deciding, okay, we need to take this massive universe and narrow it down. So I think we narrowed it down to like 13 or 15 movies and then go from there.
well, was there like one character that like it was absolutely non-negotiable, must be in that book for you?
For me, it was Ariel, mainly because watching The Little Mermaid with my mom was what made me want to go to school for animation. And kind of that's the sort of the start of the Disney Renaissance. And when the movie started to get really story driven and didn't feel so kind of like, let's make this and move on, let's make this and move on. That one felt very like, we're going to take our time and make this beautiful hand-drawn masterpiece. And so I'm very nostalgic about The Little Mermaid because that was a big deal in my life that decided where I was going to go to college. I knew at 8 years old, okay, I want to go to RISD. They have the best animation program. And I did. And to know that at 8, like this is my goal for the next 10 years. And then to have it work is pretty fantastic. So for me, it was a Little Mermaid and Mulan because she's my daughter's favorite. So
Well, when you look back at that journey from like that 8-year old who knew what she wanted to do to where you are now, what surprises you the most?
That I'm not working for Disney or Pixar. I'm not animating, but I still found a way to work with them through, a different medium. So I think this is better. This is more me. And, I kind of carved my own woolly path to still work with the companies I wanted to and be involved.
So, like on that list of books that you proposed that hasn't been picked yet, is there some idea that you like, I don't know how, but it's gonna happen?
I am very determined. Yeah, I am really good at pestering people. But I also know what is possible and what isn't, from legal standpoints. And um, one of the books we're working on right now is an unofficial one because the ancestors of or the trustees of the estate of the licensor, they don't do projects like this. So it'll be an unofficial book, which will be interesting because I haven't done something like that. And the other one is going to be, I'm so excited about it and I can't talk about it, which is such a bummer because I hate when people do that. Like, look at this amazing thing, but I'm not going to tell you about it. There's always a way, I feel. And a lot of times it's through compromise. And it's just like relationships with people, if really want to go to Scotland and your friend really wants to go to England, maybe you compromise and go to Ireland. I don't know, it's not the same, but you're still going to have a great time.
Right.
So, you gotta, there's ways to compromise for sure.
How is your husband reacting to all of that knitting all the time? Like, is there ever a moment when he's like, okay, can you do something else? Or like, is he so supportive like for all those years?
He's very supportive. He's definitely benefited. He has some beautiful knitwear. He's never been cold. Um, it, I think he's just accepted it. We met when I was 21 years old or 22, and it's always been a big part of my life. We haven't gone to the movies in years because of the pandemic, but he would always, if we were going to the movies and I was knitting in the dark, he would just say like, please, just can you put it down for like 2 hours? And it's just a way to keep my hands occupied, but I'll put it away. But he expects it and he's fine with it. And he's really encouraging the woodworking. I think he's happy to see me embracing something new, and for no reason other than it just makes me happy to learn something new. He's always been very supportive.
What does your personal yarn stash looks like?
It's intense. I've I've been shopping from my stash. During the pandemic, we weren't really going anywhere. So that encouraged me to kind of look at what I have and really organize it well. And, I firmly believe in buying the really nice yarn. But I also think there's nothing wrong with, big box store yarn too. Like I said, I learned on Lion Brand. Some people are like, oh, acrylic. Acrylic has its place. And especially, for new moms, don't knit them a wool baby blanket, knit them something they can put in the wash. So my stash is all over the place, as far as, fiber content and price range and colorways. It is very bright. I stay away from, um, kind of the more pastel colors. I, like my quilts, and clearly the yarn behind me, it is a bright stash. So
Well, I mean, when you walk by that stash place, is it like immediate source of inspiration? Do you ever go there and just stare at your wool and like see what's there, speaks to you, and what ideas pop up?
definitely. Yeah. And I do try to, I bought it, so I knew I liked it at some point. So I do try to use it too. And yeah, if it's an independent design, and I try to only use yarn that is still available. It can be a real bummer when someone releases a pattern. You're like, that is the most perfect yarn, and it's been discontinued for 15 years.
Right.
So I, try to use stuff that is still available. But yeah, I mean, I bought it and loved it. Why not use it?
How much of the stuff that you make you personally wear? Like how much of your wardrobe is made by you?
I'd say probably 10%. I don't wear a lot of my knit samples. They're often out on trunk shows. I teach even now on virtually, I teach all the time. So, I teach from them and use them. But I have a few, I tend to wear things until they can no longer be worn. I have a favorite pair of fingerless mitts. It's been cold here, so they're great for driving, and they just live in my bag, and they're all pilled, and like they're starting to get kind of worn off here, and I love them. So I tend to wear things till they can't be worn anymore.
Well, when I'm thinking of 600 designs, more now, um, do you remember each and every one? Like, is there something that you would go on Ravelry and you're like, oh, I totally forgot I ever made that?
Sure, there are some, but I also they're almost like a time capsule, like it, especially in the naming of things. I might like see a column and be like, oh yeah, I was watching that show, that's why it's named that. Or I knit that when we were at this location, or I that's what I remember more of, where or what I was doing when I knit those. Or we drive to New Hampshire every summer. It can be 14 hours. And during the when my kids were homeschooling, we went up there all the time. It was an empty house. We could cook there. It was safe. There was no germs. And we just got a change of scenery with just for that mental health break of we can go hike in the woods, where here we might not necessarily be able to do that. That was huge. So, I knit that on the drive up to New Hampshire. Or yeah, I always remember what I was doing when I was knitting or even designing. I was listening to this book, or I listen to a lot of audiobooks. So that can, inspiration's everywhere, and it always shows up in my work.
Right. I'm thinking like about myself in knitting, right? There are certain moments in time when I would meet somebody, usually online, that would change my life forever, basically. So, like, one of those people was Monique Boonstra when I accidentally stumbled on her account on Instagram and I saw the beautiful lace that she's making. And I just commented and I said, oh my God, like, what is this beautiful lace? And she told me about Shetland lace, and that's how I learned about the existence of Shetland lace. And I have been on that path for the last like 3, 4 years.
What's next to you is stunning, by the way. That shawl is beautiful.
Thank you. Do you have people like this in your life that like changed your life forever?
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. My best friend I met through, when I worked on Knitting Daily TV, I reached out to her for product, and we started talking every day. She's my daughter's godmother. She's my best friend in the world. She's a yarn dyer, the lemonade shop. I can't imagine my life without her. She's and like Kim dyes yarn. She's local to me in Virginia. We'll get together and have lunch. You meet people and you connect with them either through shared experiences, or hey, we live kind of close to each other. We're always at the same fiber festivals, or like Ross Farms. I taught for her Disney retreat for years, and then when she lost her husband, I would check in on her every day for months, and we got really close. And I didn't expect that. She asked me to teach for her. I didn't expect to find a lifelong friend there. So for sure, yeah, it's amazing to meet people that you already have this shared we love yarn and knitting thing. And I just was getting text from a friend this morning, like, I need your professional opinion. Is this cast on like completely jacked up? And like, no, it looks great. Okay. And I'll talk to her in a couple more days. I love being able to do that.
Do you find it like difficult to make friends outside of the knitting world because you like always talk about knitting, or they don't know what you do or who you are, and it's like you don't have that point of connection, immediate connection.
I think it's harder to make friends when you get older anyway. But I joined a quilting guild, so I've met some new people through that. They don't know that. A couple of them know that I knit, and came up and said like, oh, you're this big knitter. So like, I'm here as a quilter. Let's quilt. I don't want to talk about knitting right now. And I have a lot of mom friends. We walk to school every day and back. So, they don't necessarily know what I do, or they might say, I friended you on Facebook and I see that you do this weird knitting thing for a living. And they don't know anything about our world. And we just talk about our kids, or like you meet people at the dog park. And yeah, I'm weirdly shy in outside of my knitting life. I'm trying to get better at that. But yeah, you meet people and random things. I've been trying to take more classes with, not related to knitting. I'm always the teacher, so it's nice to be the student too.
That was my question to you. Like as an instructor in knitting, and you've done so many different kinds of classes, you're coming into the quilting as a total newbie. You like learning, you are a student. How does that feel? Like do you see like the similarities between the crafts?
Yeah, there's definitely that kind of that pre-crafting, regardless of what you're doing setup. Okay, what are my materials? So pulling fabric is very similar to pulling yarn, and having a picture of this finished quilt you're going to make, and will this look right, and always reading the pattern all the way through. And with knitting, it's just, I know what to do. So it's really exciting to maybe read about this new seam that I don't understand, or become better friends with my sewing machine, or it's interesting. And when I teach, I always try to think about what the student might need from me, and that's really been great when teaching my son's Boy Scout troop, or women that I can't communicate with other than like, let me show you. That's really, I think, maybe a better person and a better teacher, of kind of anticipating what they need. So and I'm not afraid to ask questions. I will be that person that asks all the questions, because I do want to learn as much as I can.
If you had all the time in the world, like let's say you were in the time capsule for a year and you can just do whatever you want to do, what do you think would happen during that year?
I really want to learn how to make furniture. Um, it, for no other reason than I just think it would be an interesting experience. I took a wood bending class, and to be able to take this kind of a mobile hard material and bend it was really interesting, and it's so mysterious to me. And it's they're incredibly different materials. My husband said, this is an odd material choice for you. You're knitting with these beautiful soft fluffy things, and now you're out like learning about the different types of wood that are native to our area. And I think I would learn some like furniture joining. I don't know. It's out of my comfort zone, and I'm very curious, so I'm always game to learn anything. I think that would be interesting.
Well, I have this question, and it's like sort of silly, but I was interviewing a few quilters recently, and we always talk about like the quilts that like people find in museums and what kind of stories they tell and all of that. If you could create like a container to be buried and to be found 1,000 years from now, what would you want to put in it for people to find that's gonna give them this idea about you, like, and what kind of person you are?
It's interesting. Because I just want to be tossed in a river, just let me go and feed some animals. Um, I think I don't, that's interesting. I find what we use to create our materials really tell a story. Like, I have one of my grandmother's crochet hooks, and I love that it was her crochet hook. And, I think about her every time I use it. So, maybe like my favorite knitting needles, or, my favorite spoon carving knife, or, that's interesting. I really want to make a crazy quilt. You mentioned quilts in museums, when women weren't really doing much other than raising their family. Not that that is not a massive, all-encompassing job, but they were always doing handiwork. Maybe making this massive crazy quilt by hand, of all fabrics from people that were important to me. Because I don't know, I think about my life in terms of, who's in my tribe, kind of, who are my people, and how can I carry them along with me? And whether a friend makes me a piece of jewelry, or whatever I make, I don't see as precious. I see it as something that I can give to somebody else. So when someone gives me something, that is very meaningful to me. So I think I'd rather fill it with stuff from other people.
Right. Well, when you told me that you always making gifts for others and you giving mittens to anybody who wants it and who doesn't, was there ever like disappointing moment of like giving somebody a gift that you were like making for them and they not wearing it or tossing it in the washer and dryer and like destroying it or anything like that. Is there anybody who you think is not knit worthy?
I used to say everyone is knitworthy, but they're they're not, in my opinion. Yes, I've had um a couple disappointing, family members in the craft department of, I made someone a beautiful shawl that, was on lace weight, and I agonized over it and the perfect colors, and it's still in the wrapping paper, 15 years later, shoved at the bottom of a linen closet. And I always think I'm just going to take this back and, give this shawl the life it deserves, out in the sunlight. But it was made for that person. I could never wear it and think that it was mine. It was made for that person. So, learning experience, I learned they're not knit worthy. And, it's usually family members. And that's hard because, you still love them, but now, they don't get a quilt, or they don't get a lace weight shawl. My dad's mom, my grandmother, who I'm apparently very much like, she was incredibly smart, and her dad, she got a full scholarship to college, in the 20s,
Right.
100 years ago, and her dad wouldn't let her go because he didn't want to buy her books. And so she, became a wife and a mother, and she just crocheted this one specific afghan over and over, and that's all she made. And that was kind of the extent of her craftiness, was picking the colorways. But everybody got one, including me, which I love. And, a family member got one, and they used it as a dog blanket. And that is just heartbreaking, especially, that she's gone, and, they use it as a dog blanket. So yeah, I think you learn, I think, deep down, a lot of us know who's knitworthy and who's not, or craft worthy. But people can still disappoint you sometimes. But you live and you learn. I
Right.
don't know.
Well, does um like any of your experiences with like book writing or pattern writing, did you ever feel disappointed in yourself? Did you ever feel like you didn't put all the effort in it? Or is it like a baby, like everyone is absolutely have a place in your heart?
I think in retrospect, there's always something you think you could have done better, right? And that's the case with anything. Even, cooking, like, oh, I could have used more spice, or, my noodle choice was weird, or something as simple as that. Hindsight is invaluable. But I've also learned that to learn from, and I don't see them as mistakes. I see them as, I could have done that better. It's an opportunity to do better next time. And also, skills evolve and grow. So maybe, my stranded colorwork design wasn't where it is now. At the time, that was the best I could do, and I can be proud of that. But now I can also use it as a benchmark and see how I've improved and grown, and try to turn it into a positive experience, rather than like, oh, that cowl really stunk, and I should just take it down. It's the worst thing ever. It shouldn't even be in existence. Everything's a stepping stone. So I think if people only put out what they think is their absolute best, then they're not gaining what they could from that experience. There's always room to improve, always.
Well, if somebody comes to you and they are toying with the idea of becoming a knitwear designers, what would be your advice to them?
I get asked that a lot, and I usually say, what's stopping you? It's, people are very good at standing in their own way, and you don't have to have this journey of, art school and Vogue Knitting and writing books and all that. If you want to make a cowl with bunnies on it or whatever, the only one stopping you from doing that is you. So why not? I was in a wood carving class a couple weeks ago, and the guy said, oh, you make spoons. I really want to make spoons. I can't bring myself to do it. I have all this stuff. And I said, why not? He said, well, what if I screw it up? I said, so what? Then, you learned how not to make a spoon. Nobody died. We're in very weird times. Why not try something? You don't know how much time you've got. So I always try to be really encouraging, because people stand in their own way.
Well, I'm so glad I asked you to be a guest on my channel today because I feel like you're inspired me to try some new things maybe.
Oh, good.
And
I
I
hope
hope
so.
you inspired some of the viewers to try some new things and, pursue their ideas and pursue their dreams. And I can't wait to see what those books that you're working on.
That's super.
I'll
Yeah.
be watching those.
It's hard to keep, books they can take 2 to 3 years. I don't think people realize how far in advance you work, especially with big companies where everything has to go through multiple boards of people or panels of people. Um, so it's hard to kind of keep it a secret. And then by the time it comes out, you're already working on the next few. And it's like, oh yeah, I remember that. That was fun. Let's talk about that. So it's interesting to work so far in advance all the time.
Right. Well, I can't wait to see those books being published, and I'll be watching out for them. Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you for being my guest today. I
Well,
really
thanks for having me. It was great fun.
thank you.